James once built companies and signed million-dollar deals. But today, he's doing something completely different. Instead of running a business, James is standing in the yard behind the house with a hoe in his hands, determined to build a small garden for Diep. It may look simple, just soil, bamboo poles, and a few packets of seeds. But sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest meaning. Because this garden isn't just about growing vegetables. It's about building a peaceful life together. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Litu Diep VN. In today's episode, after learning how to cook for Diep, James takes another step toward their new life in the village. This time, he decides to build something special for her. A small garden where they can grow vegetables, herbs, and flowers together. Sometimes happiness doesn't come from success or wealth, but from the simple moments we create with the people we love. Before we begin, if you enjoy warm and heartfelt stories like this, please consider subscribing to the channel. We're on our way to 1,000 subscribers, and your support truly means the world to us. Now, let's continue the story. The morning air in the mountain village carried the quiet freshness that only came after a cool night. Thin mist still lingered above the bamboo grove behind the wooden house, drifting slowly across the small yard as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the hills. Inside the house, Diep was already awake. She stood near the window, watering a small clay pot that sat quietly on the wooden ledge. Inside the pot grew a single chili plant. Its leaves were small but bright green, reaching upward toward the light with surprising determination. Diep touched one of the leaves gently. "You're growing well," she murmured softly. Just then, footsteps approached from outside. The back door opened. James stepped in, carrying a long piece of bamboo over his shoulder. His clothes were dusty again, and once again, his hands looked like they had spent the morning working very hard. Diep turned around. "What are you carrying this time?" James leaned the bamboo pole against the wall. "Building material." Diep raised an eyebrow. "For what?" James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the window and noticed the small chili plant. "You like growing plants, don't you?" he asked. Diep looked at the pot. "I used to." "What happened?" She smiled faintly. "Life got busy." James studied the plant quietly. Then he turned back toward the door. "Come outside for a minute." Diep crossed her arms. That sentence usually means trouble. James laughed. "Trust me." After a brief hesitation, Diep followed him outside. The small yard behind the house looked the same as always. Uneven soil, a few scattered stones, and beyond the yard, the thick bamboo forest standing like a green wall along the slope. Diep looked around. "All right," she said. "What am I supposed to see?" James walked to the center of the yard and spread his arms wide. "Right here." Diep frowned slightly. "Right here what?" "A garden." Diep blinked. "A garden?" James nodded enthusiastically. "Yes." He pointed toward different corners of the yard as if he could already see something invisible. "Vegetables here, flowers over there, and maybe a small row of herbs near the fence." Diep stared at him for a moment. Then she laughed. "You've been digging bamboo shoots for too long." James shook his head. "I'm serious." He walked over to the bamboo pole he had brought earlier and picked it up again. "I thought about it last night." Diep tilted her head. "Thought about what?" James pushed the pole into the soil to test the ground. "This house has everything we need." He looked around the yard, but it could feel even more alive. Diep watched him silently. James continued, "You told me once that you like growing plants. That was a long time ago." "Well," James said with a small grin, "I'm bringing it back." Diep looked at the bamboo pole, now stuck in the ground. Are you planning to turn this entire yard into a farm? James pretended to consider the idea. That's not a bad plan. Diep laughed again. You're unbelievable. But despite the teasing in her voice, something warm had already begun forming inside her chest. Because James wasn't just talking. He was already working. He picked up a small hoe that leaned against the fence and began clearing a section of soil near the bamboo pole. The ground was uneven and packed with small stones. But James attacked the task with determination. Diep leaned against the fence, watching him for a moment. You know, building a garden isn't easy, she said. James didn't stop digging. I'm starting to notice that. You'll have to prepare the soil. I can do that. You'll need fences so the chickens don't eat everything. I can build that. You'll have to water the plants every day. James paused and looked up. Are you trying to scare me? Diep smirked. I'm just explaining reality. James wiped sweat from his forehead and smiled. Reality looks pretty good to me. He returned to digging. Slowly, the small section of ground began to transform. Loose soil replaced the hardened dirt. Stones were pushed aside. Small lines formed where rows of plants might grow someday. Diep watched quietly. The morning sun grew brighter. Birds began chirping from the bamboo grove, and the quiet rhythm of James's work slowly filled the yard. Finally, Diep walked over. She crouched beside him and picked up one of the stones he had dug out. You missed this one, she said. James looked at the stone. Oh. He took it and tossed it aside. Diep reached down again and smoothed part of the soil with her hand. If you're making a garden, she said, the rows should be straight. James studied the line she had drawn. You're helping now. I'm supervising. That sounds familiar. Diep smiled faintly. James leaned back on his heels and looked around the yard again. You know, he said thoughtfully, I used to think success meant building companies. He gestured toward the small patch of soil. But this feels more real. Diep brushed the dirt from her hands. You've changed a lot. James shrugged. Maybe I just finally slowed down enough to see what matters. For a moment, they both sat quietly beside the unfinished garden. The breeze moved softly through the bamboo trees. And somewhere in the distance, a dog barked lazily. James suddenly stood up again. This is just the beginning, he said. Diep raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? James grabbed another bamboo pole. We still need the fence. He looked toward the edge of the yard where the bamboo grove began, and maybe a small gate. Diep laughed. You're really serious about this? James smiled. Very serious. He pushed the second bamboo pole into the soil. If we're going to build a peaceful life here, we might as well start with a garden. Diep looked at the small patch of freshly turned soil. It wasn't much. Just a few lines of dirt, a couple of bamboo poles, and the beginning of something simple. But somehow, it already felt like the start of something beautiful. The morning slowly stretched into late afternoon. What had begun as a simple idea in James's mind had now turned into real work. The patch behind the wooden house no longer looked like the uneven yard. The soil had been loosened and shaped into several straight rows, and small bamboo poles now stood upright along the edges like quiet guards. James stepped back and looked at the progress with satisfaction. Not perfect, but a beginning. He leaned on the hoe, catching his breath as the warm mountain wind drifted gently through the bamboo grove behind them. Diep stood nearby, brushing the dirt from her hands. You've been working for hours, she said. James glanced at the sky. I didn't notice. That's because you're stubborn. He laughed softly. That too. Diep walked slowly along the edge of the small garden. studying the rows James had made. Her eyes followed the lines of soil carefully, as if imagining what might grow there someday. "What are you thinking?" James asked. Diep crouched beside one of the rows and ran her fingers lightly across the soft dirt. "If we plant herbs here," she said, "they'll get enough sunlight in the morning." James nodded seriously, as if she were giving instructions for an important construction project. "And vegetables here," she continued, pointing toward the wider patch. James walked closer. "What about flowers?" he asked. Diep looked up, surprised. "Flowers?" "Yes," James shrugged. "Every garden should have flowers." Diep smiled slightly. "That sounds like something an inexperienced farmer would say." James grinned. "I am an inexperienced farmer." Diep stood up again and looked toward the small pile of bamboo poles stacked near the fence. "You still need to build the barrier," she said. James followed her gaze. "Yes, if you don't, the chickens from the neighbor's house will eat everything." James picked up one of the poles and examined it. "Then we build a fence." Diep crossed her arms. "You make everything sound so simple." James drove the pole into the soil firmly. "That's because simple is good." He grabbed another pole and began measuring the distance between them. The afternoon sun grew warmer, casting long shadows across the yard. Diep watched him for a while before stepping closer. "You're placing them too far apart," she said. James stopped. "I am?" "Yes." She adjusted the pole slightly. "If the gap is too wide, the animals will get through." James nodded. "Good point." Diep gave him a small sideways glance. "You're actually listening." James smiled. "I told you earlier." "You're supervising." Diep laughed quietly. The sound felt light in the open air. After the poles were placed, James began tying thin bamboo strips between them to form a simple fence. It wasn't elegant, but it was strong. By the time the final strip was secured, the small garden had a clear border separating it from the yard. James stepped back again, wiping sweat from his forehead. "There." Diep walked along the fence slowly, inspecting the work. She touched one of the bamboo ties. "It's sturdy." James folded his arms proudly. "Of course." Diep looked at him with a teasing smile. "For someone who only became a farmer 2 weeks ago." James laughed. "Hey, progress is progress." They stood together quietly for a moment, looking at the small garden. It was still empty, just rows of soil waiting patiently, but somehow it already felt alive. James suddenly turned toward the house. "Wait here," he said. Diep frowned. "What are you doing now?" James disappeared inside. A moment later, he returned carrying a small cloth bag. He opened it carefully. Inside were several small packets of seeds. Diep's eyes widened slightly. "Where did you get those?" James shrugged. "The market." "You bought seeds?" "Yes." Diep picked up one of the packets and read the label. "Tomatoes." Another packet. "Coriander." And another. "Chili peppers." She looked up at him. "You really planned this?" James rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. "Maybe." Diep shook her head slowly. "You're unbelievable." James handed her the packet of chili seeds. "First plant goes to you." Diep looked down at the tiny seeds in her palm. For a moment she didn't move, because the last time she had planted anything, life had been very different. But now, James waited beside her patiently, not pushing, just watching. Finally, Diep knelt beside the first row of soil. She dug a small hole with her fingers and placed the seeds gently into the earth. James crouched beside her. "Like that?" he asked. Diep covered the seeds with soil. "Yes." She pressed the dirt lightly. "That's the first plant in our garden." James repeated her words quietly. "Our garden." Diep glanced at him. "You're claiming ownership already?" James smiled. "I'm claiming responsibility." The sunlight had begun turning golden as the afternoon moved toward evening. A warm breeze drifted across the yard, carrying the soft rustling sound of bamboo leaves. James stood up and looked across the small garden again. "You know," he said, "this might take a while to grow." Diep stood beside him. "That's how gardens work." James nodded. "Good." Diep tilted her head. "Why good?" James looked at her. "Because it means we'll be here long enough to watch it grow." For a moment, Diep didn't answer. The breeze moved softly through the bamboo again, and the quiet yard behind the house felt peaceful in an unexpected way. James leaned lightly against the bamboo fence they had just built. "Next step," he said. Diep raised an eyebrow. "There's more?" James pointed toward the far corner of the yard. "Maybe a small bench." Diep laughed. "So you can sit and watch your farm?" James grinned. "Exactly." Diep looked at the small garden once more. Rows of soil, a simple bamboo fence, and one tiny patch where the first seeds had just been planted. It wasn't much, but it was enough, because sometimes the beginning of a peaceful life didn't arrive with something grand. Sometimes it began quietly, with a handful of seeds, and the promise that tomorrow something new might grow.